The small fishing village nestled on the rocky coast of Jeju Island had weathered many storms throughout its long history. Generations of families had pulled their living from the sea, fathers teaching sons the secret spots where fish gathered, mothers showing daughters how to mend nets with swift, practiced hands. For over 300 years, the rhythm of life had remained largely unchanged, until the morning Mr. Kim noticed something strange in the water. It started with an unusual greenish tint along the shoreline. At first, no one paid much attention. The sea changed colors sometimes, that's what seas do. But by the third day, dead fish began washing ashore. Not just a few, but hundreds, then thousands. "I've never seen anything like this," whispered Mr. Kim, his weathered hands trembling as he picked up a lifeless yellowtail. At 78, he was the oldest fisherman in the village and head of their small cooperative. His eyes, still sharp, despite his age, scanned the horizon with growing dread. The younger fishermen pulled their boats to shore, nets nearly empty. Whatever was killing the fish was spreading fast. The normally bustling harbor fell quiet as people gathered in worried clusters, pointing at the water that had sustained their families for centuries, but now seemed to have turned against them. Tests confirmed what they feared. A toxic algae bloom of unprecedented scale had taken over their fishing grounds. The local government sent scientists who took samples and shook their heads grimly. "The concentration is off the charts," one told Mr. Kim. "We've never recorded levels this high before." Within weeks, the village economy spiraled downward. No fish meant no income. The small restaurant owners who relied on fresh catches closed their doors. The market stalls sat empty. Children stopped attending school as families struggled to put food on their tables. Mrs. Yoon, who had run the village store for 30 years, started keeping a list of families who couldn't pay their bills. "Pay when you can," she told them, though her own suppliers weren't nearly as understanding. The village council met nightly in the small community hall. Maps spread across tables showed the growing red zone where fishing was impossible. Each meeting ended the same way, with no solutions and more despair. "My family has fished these waters since my great-grandfather's time," said Mr. Doe, slamming his fist on the table. "Now I tell my son to look for work in the city. This can't be how our story ends." But the situation only worsened. The algae spread faster than anyone predicted. Scientists explained that warming waters and changing currents had created perfect conditions for the bloom. When they used technical terms and complex explanations, the villagers nodded politely, but afterward, they gathered at Mr. Kim's house, seeking translations into practical solutions. "They talk a lot," Mr. Kim said, "but their words don't catch fish." Government officials arrived next with clipboards and promises. They spoke of grants and loans to tide the village over. "Until when?" asked Ms. Park, a young mother whose husband had already left to find construction work in Seoul. "Until the sea heals or until we all move away?" The officials had no answer. By the second month, boats sat idle, their bright colors fading under the relentless sun. Nets hung stiff with disuse. The harbor that once echoed with shouts and laughter fell silent, except for the constant lap of poisoned water against the pier. Some families packed up and left. Their empty houses stood like missing teeth in the village's smile. Those who remained did so out of stubbornness or lack of options. The elderly especially refused to leave. "Where would I go?" asked Mrs. Jin, who had been born in her little blue house by the harbor 82 years earlier. "My bones belong to this place." The local government brought in equipment, massive filters and chemical treatments designed to break down the algae. For 3 days, workers in protective suits poured solutions into the water while machines hummed day and night. The villagers watched with hope that slowly turned to disappointment when tests showed minimal improvement. "The bloom is too established," explained the project leader. "We're like someone trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." The regional news picked up the story. Reporters came with cameras, filming the dead fish and interviewing tearful villagers. For a brief moment, the outside world looked their way, but attention soon shifted to other disasters, other stories. Mr. Kim took to sitting on the harbor wall each morning, staring at the sea that had defined his existence. His grandson, just 6 years old, sat beside him one day and asked, "Grandpa, did we do something to make the ocean angry?" The old man had no answer. But that night, as he lay awake listening to the waves, he wondered if perhaps the child had asked exactly the right question. Had they taken too much? Failed to notice warning signs? The thought troubled him deeply as he watched his village, his whole world, slowly dying around him. And still the algae spread, choking life from the waters that had sustained them for generations. The crisis wasn't just about fish anymore. It was about identity, community, and survival itself. As the third month began, even the most optimistic villagers began to accept the unthinkable, that their way of life might truly be coming to an end. The morning Mr. Park from the Environmental Ministry arrived. Everyone noticed his spotless suit and city shoes that were completely wrong for the village's muddy paths. He stepped carefully around puddles, clutching an expensive leather briefcase as villagers gathered to hear what he had to say. "I've brought the latest technology," he announced proudly, opening his case to reveal what looked like a small submarine, with blinking lights. "This autonomous water treatment device will analyze and neutralize the algae. The ministry has invested millions in this solution." Hope flickered across tired faces. After weeks of watching their livelihoods disappear, any solution seemed worth trying. Mr. Kim nodded respectfully, but noticed how Mr. Park avoided actually touching the water when demonstrating how the device worked. The next morning, 5 identical machines were deployed across the bay. They hummed and bubbled, releasing carefully measured chemicals designed to break down the toxic algae. Villagers gathered on the shore, watching anxiously. "How long before we see results?" asked Mr. Doe, who had already sold his boat engine to pay for his daughter's school fees. 3 days at most, Mr. Park promised confidently. 3 days passed, then 5. After a week, Mr. Park's perfect suit looked considerably less crisp as he stared in confusion at the test results. Not only had the algae levels not decreased, they'd actually risen in 2 locations. "I don't understand," he muttered, tapping frantically on his tablet. This technology worked perfectly in controlled laboratory conditions. Mrs. Lee, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Perhaps the sea is not a laboratory." Mr. Park left with promises to return with better solutions. The machines were collected, their failure adding another layer of despair to the village's mood. The next attempt came from Ms. Lee, a marine biologist with kind eyes and practical rubber boots that immediately earned her more respect than Mr. Park had managed. She brought a team of graduate students who set up monitoring stations and spoke excitedly about bioremediation and natural predator introduction. "We'll introduce specific bacteria that feed on this type of algae," she explained, to the village council. "It's like bringing in a natural enemy to control the problem." For 2 weeks, her team worked tirelessly, taking samples, adjusting formulas, and releasing carefully cultivated bacterial colonies into the affected areas. The villagers helped where they could, hoping that this more natural approach might succeed where chemicals had failed. Initially, there were promising signs. Small patches of clearer water appeared near the treatment zones. Ms. Lee's students high-fived each other and spoke optimistically about breakthrough curves and exponential decline rates. But then the weather changed. A 3-day storm churned the waters, dispersing the bacterial treatment and disrupting the carefully established balance. When the skies cleared, the algae had rebounded more aggressively than before, spreading to previously unaffected areas. Ms. Lee didn't make excuses. She stood before the village with her data and admitted defeat. "The ecosystem is too destabilized," she said quietly. "The approach that works in smaller affected areas can't scale to something this extensive." As she packed up her equipment, she hugged Mrs. Yoon, who had brought her team homemade meals throughout their stay. "Don't give up," she whispered. "Sometimes when science fails, people find another way." But hope was becoming a scarce resource in the village. The third attempt brought the heaviest equipment and the loudest promises. A company specializing in environmental disasters arrived with machines that looked like they belonged on a construction site, rather than near delicate marine ecosystems. "We'll physically remove the contaminated water," explained the project manager. pointing to massive pumps and filtration systems being assembled on the pier. Then we'll return clean water to maintain the bay's level. The operation was impressive to watch. Huge pipes extended into the bay, sucking up thousands of gallons of greenish water into filtration tanks where it was treated before being returned to the sea. The noise was constant, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the natural sounds of the village. For 4 days, the machines worked at maximum capacity. The company representative showed the villagers charts of improving water quality in the processed areas. But it soon became clear they were fighting a losing battle. They simply couldn't process water fast enough to outpace the algae's growth. On the 5th day, one of the main pumps failed, damaged by the density of the algae it was trying to process. Repairs would take weeks and cost more than the remaining budget allowed. The project was abandoned, the equipment loaded onto trucks that left deep tire tracks in the village's only road. By this point, half the village's families had left. Houses stood empty, windows staring like vacant eyes at the poisoned sea. The school closed when attendance dropped below 15 students. The younger fishermen found work in construction or factories in distant cities, sending money home to families they might not see for months. Those who remained moved through their days with the heavy steps of people carrying invisible weights. The failure of each attempted solution took another small piece of their hope. Mr. Kim kept a calendar where he marked each day of the crisis with a simple X. As he added the 93rd mark, he realized he was running out of space on the page. Soon he would need to start a new month, a thought that seemed impossible back when the crisis began. In the evenings, fewer and fewer people gathered at the community hall. Conversations became shorter, silences longer. What was there to say, when every path forward seemed blocked? On a particularly quiet night, as Mr. Kim walked home alone after another disappointing meeting, he noticed something unusual, laughter coming from young Mr. Han's house. Han had studied at a university on the mainland before returning to the village to help his aging parents. Unlike most, he still seemed to have energy, still seemed to believe there might be answers they hadn't yet tried. Mr. Kim paused outside, listening to the animated conversation within. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different from anything he'd heard in the village for months. There was excitement. He hesitated, then knocked on the door. Mr. Han's small living room was crowded with maps and printouts spread across every surface. Several younger villagers sat cross-legged, on floor cushions, leaning forward with an intensity Mr. Kim hadn't seen in months. They fell silent when he entered, exchanging uncertain glances. "Don't stop on my account," Mr. Kim said, accepting the tea Mr. Han's mother pressed into his hands. "What's got everyone so worked up?" Mr. Han hesitated before speaking. At 32, he was caught between generations, respected by the younger villagers for his education, but still expected to defer to elders like Mr. Kim. "I've been thinking about a lecture I attended during my final year at university," he finally said. An environmental scientist from the coastal region of Vietnam presented a case study about a village that faced something similar to our situation. He pointed to a grainy photo showing a shoreline that could have been their own. The same sickly green water, the same empty boats pulled up on shore. Their government tried the same solutions ours did. Equipment, chemicals, bacteria. Nothing worked. Mr. Kim nodded wearily. "So what makes this story worth telling?" "Because they solved it," Mr. Han said simply. "Not with better technology, but with a completely different approach." The room seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Han explained. The Vietnamese village had eventually reached out to a collective of environmental activists, led by someone who combined traditional ecological knowledge with modern science. Instead of fighting against nature with technology, they had worked with natural systems using human observation and cooperation. They called themselves the Human Solution because they believed that sometimes the most sophisticated technology is human beings working together with deep understanding, Mr. Han explained. Mr. Du, who had been listening from the doorway, snorted skeptically. "So what exactly did these miracle workers do that teams of scientists with millions in equipment couldn't?" Mr. Han smiled. That's exactly what I've been trying to find out. I've spent weeks tracking down the leader of that project. He held up his phone, showing a simple message thread. And tonight, she finally responded. The room erupted in excited chatter. Mr. Kim raised his hand for silence. Who is this person, and why would they help us? Her name is Ms. Bae, Mr. Han replied. She's Korean but has worked internationally for 15 years, and she'll help because that's what she does. She believes in sharing solutions freely between communities facing environmental crises. Mr. Kim studied the younger man carefully. The government officials won't like this. They prefer solutions that come through proper channels. With respect, sir, Mr. Han said quietly. Proper channels have failed us 93 days in a row. The silence that followed was heavy with the truth of those words. Finally, Mr. Kim nodded. Tell us what, Ms. Bae said. Over the next hour, Mr. Han explained the approach that had worked in Vietnam and several other coastal communities since then. It wasn't a quick technological fix, but rather a methodology that required full community participation. Ms. Bae's team would come to train them, but the villagers themselves would need to do the work. She needs to know we're committed, Mr. Han concluded. All of us. It won't work otherwise. The following morning, Mr. Kim called an emergency village meeting. The community hall was fuller than it had been in weeks as word spread that something new was happening. Even some families who had moved to nearby towns returned to hear what was being proposed. Mr. Han presented everything he had learned from Ms. Bae, answering questions as best he could. Not everyone was convinced. You want us to trust our future to some foreigners with no credentials? Demanded the owner of what had once been the village's busiest seafood restaurant. Their credential is success, replied Mr. Han calmly. They've done what no one else has managed to do. The debate continued until Mrs. Yoon, who rarely spoke at these gatherings, stood up. My family has lived in this village for 6 generations, she said, her voice soft but clear. I've watched our community disappear person by person, hope by hope. What's left to lose by trying something different? Her words seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. One by one, people nodded in agreement. The vote was nearly unanimous. They would invite Ms. Bae and her team. Getting official approval wasn't as easy. The local government representatives were skeptical of this unconventional approach that bypassed their authority. But when Mr. Kim threatened to take the story to national media, complete with detailed accounts of every failed government intervention, they reluctantly agreed to allow Ms. Bae's team to visit in an advisory capacity. The village came alive with preparations. Empty houses were cleaned to accommodate the visitors. The community kitchen, unused since the last festival before the crisis, was scrubbed and ready to feed the team. Children were assigned as runners to carry messages between working groups. For the first time in months, there was energy in the air, not quite hope yet, but something close to it. Something that made people walk a little faster, speak a little louder. 3 days later, a van pulled up outside the community hall. 5 people climbed out, stretching after the long drive from the airport. They carried backpacks and simple equipment. Nothing like the truckloads of machinery previous experts had brought. Ms. Bae was nothing like what most villagers had expected. Small in stature with practical clothes and a ready smile, she looked more like someone's favorite aunt than an environmental savior. She greeted everyone in fluent Korean, showing special respect to the village elders. Before we discuss solutions, she said when they gathered in the community hall, we need to truly understand what's happening here, not just with the algae but with the people, the history, the relationships. Everything is connected. She unfolded a blank piece of paper. This is our plan, she said. Someone laughed nervously. It's empty, Ms. Bae nodded. Because we will write it together. You know this place better than anyone. You have generations of knowledge about these waters. That knowledge is our most powerful tool. As darkness fell that first evening, Mr. Kim walked slowly home. For the first time in 3 months, his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't sure if Ms. Bae's methods would work, but watching her team spread out through the village, listening intently to everyone from the oldest fisherman to the youngest child, He understood something important had already changed. The village had stopped waiting to be saved and started participating in its own rescue. Dawn broke with an unusual sense of purpose across the village. By 6 in the morning, nearly everyone had gathered at the community hall, where Ms. Bay and her team had converted the walls into a massive information center. Maps of the coastline were marked with colored pins, timelines stretched across tables, and photographs of the bay taken over decades were arranged in chronological order. "Today we begin," Ms. Bay announced, her voice carrying easily through the crowded room. Not as experts and villagers, but as one team with a shared goal. She introduced the members of her group: Mr. Choi, a hydrologist who studied water flow patterns; Ms. Song, who specialized in microbial ecosystems; and 2 others who focused on community coordination and data collection. None of them wore lab coats or carried expensive equipment. Their most advanced technology appeared to be regular tablets and a few water testing kits no more complicated than what high school students might use. "The first step is observation," Ms. Bay explained. "Not just occasional samples, but continuous human monitoring across multiple points, multiple times daily." She divided the villagers into teams of 4, assigning each team specific locations along the coastline. Even children were given roles as record keepers and runners. The elderly, whose knowledge of how the waters had changed over decades was invaluable, served as advisors at each location. "We need to see patterns that machines might miss," Ms. Bay told them. "Human eyes notice things instruments don't always catch." Mr. Kim found himself teamed with Mrs. Yoon, young Mr. Han, and a teenager named Sunja, whose family had moved to the nearby city but returned daily to help. Their assigned spot was a small cove where 2 underwater currents met, a place Mr. Kim had fished since childhood. Each team carried simple equipment: glass jars for water samples, thermometers, pH testing strips, and notebooks. Every hour from sunrise to sunset, they collected and recorded data. Not just numbers, but observations about water color, smell, movement, and anything unusual they noticed. "This feels too simple," Mrs. Yoon whispered to Mr. Kim as they labeled their 4th sample of the day. "How can this work when $1 million equipment failed?" Mr. Kim had no answer, but he noticed something he hadn't before: how the algae seemed to pulse with the tides, thicker in some places at certain times of day. He'd been so focused on the disaster itself he hadn't really looked at its patterns. By midday, the village was a hive of activity. Teams called out to each other across the water, comparing notes. Runners sprinted between stations, carrying samples and updates to the community hall where Ms. Song and Mr. Choi were building what they called a living map of the ecosystem. For 3 days, this constant monitoring continued. Some villagers grumbled about the pointlessness of just watching the problem, but most threw themselves into the work, finding unexpected satisfaction in the methodical collection of data. Children competed to see whose team could gather the most precise readings. Elderly villagers shared stories about how the currents had shifted over their lifetimes. On the 4th morning, Ms. Bay called everyone together to reveal what they'd learned. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the now complex map covered with markers and strings connecting different points. "The algae isn't random. It follows specific patterns tied to water temperature, current, and, most importantly, something we didn't expect." She pointed to an area just beyond the harbor entrance where a new concrete channel had been built 2 years earlier to control flooding during monsoon season. "This structure has changed how water circulates in your bay," she explained. "It creates a pocket where nutrients concentrate, feeding the algae bloom. Previous teams missed this because they were looking at the algae itself, not the conditions helping it thrive." Mr. Choi stepped forward with a simple diagram. "The channel creates a circular current pattern that traps warmer water here and here," he explained, pointing to red zones on the map. "Warmer water with concentrated nutrients from land runoff creates perfect conditions for this particular algae species." A murmur ran through the crowd as people recognized the truth of this observation. The algae bloom had first appeared shortly after the channel's construction, though no one had connected the events. "So we destroy the channel?" asked the village council head, already looking worried about government approval for such action. "No," Ms. Bay smiled. "We work with it. We can't change the channel's existence, but we can modify how water flows through and around it." What she proposed next was both elegantly simple and deeply labor-intensive, using only bamboo poles, netting, and stones, materials that would naturally break down over time without harming the ecosystem. They would create a series of underwater barriers that would redirect currents, disperse the nutrient-rich pockets, and break up the warm water, zones where algae thrived. "The key is placement," Ms. Song explained. "Each barrier must be precisely positioned to work with natural water movement, not against it." The work began that afternoon. Teams waded into the shallower areas, driving bamboo poles into the seabed at exactly the points Ms. Bay's team had calculated. Other groups prepared the netting, weaving it between poles in specific patterns designed to filter rather than block water flow. It was exhausting work that required everyone's participation. Even those who had been skeptical found themselves drawn in by the communal effort. Children too young to help in the water sorted materials on shore. The elderly prepared meals for the workers and maintained the increasingly detailed maps and data logs. By sunset, nearly a quarter of the planned barriers were in place. As darkness fell, people gathered around fires on the beach comparing blisters and sharing meals. There was laughter, a sound that had been rare in the village for months. The work continued for 2 more days. Where the water was too deep for wading, boats that had sat idle for months were pressed into service. Mr. Doe, who had sold his engine, found 5 other men to help row his boat into position. Every barrier was checked and rechecked to ensure it matched the carefully calculated design. On the 3rd day, as the final sections were being completed, a small crowd gathered on the harbor wall, staring intently at the water near the first barriers they'd installed. "Is it my imagination?" Mrs. Yoon asked quietly. "Or does the water look a little clearer there?" Mr. Kim squinted against the afternoon sun. The difference was subtle, not something anyone would notice if they weren't looking for it, but undeniable. The greenish tint was slightly less intense around the bamboo structures. Ms. Bay joined them, nodding with quiet satisfaction. "It's working," she said simply. "Slowly, but it's working." That evening, as the entire village gathered in the community hall, exhausted but energized, Ms. Bay explained what would happen next. "The barriers will help, but they're only part of the solution," she said. "Now we need to boost the water's natural ability to heal itself." She explained how they would introduce specific plants along the shoreline, species that would help filter excess nutrients from the water. Some areas would need to be temporarily closed off to allow natural predators of the algae to establish themselves. "The recovery won't happen overnight," she cautioned. "Nature needs time to find its balance again. But you've done the hardest part. You've interrupted the cycle that was feeding the problem." As the meeting ended, Mr. Kim found himself standing next to young Mr. Han. Together they looked at the map that now showed their village's waters covered with the markers of hope. "We did this," Mr. Han said quietly. "Not machines or chemicals. Us?" Mr. Kim nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. After months of helplessness, they had finally found their power. Not in technology, but in understanding, cooperation, and the wisdom to work with nature rather than against it. That night, for the first time in over 3 months, Mr. Kim slept without dreaming of dead fish and empty boats. 3 months passed like a slow tide washing over the village. Winter gave way to early spring, bringing gentler rains and longer days. The transformation in the water came gradually, so gradually that those who monitored it daily sometimes questioned whether they were seeing real change or just hoping too hard. But the weekly photographs didn't lie. Areas near the bamboo barriers showed steadily decreasing algae concentration. Clear patches of water appeared first as small islands in the green, then grew like puzzle pieces fitting together. Fish returned, cautiously at first, just a few, smaller species testing the recovering waters. Then more came, including some varieties that hadn't been seen since before the crisis began. Mr. Kim kept his old routine of walking to the harbor each morning before sunrise, but now, Instead of staring hopelessly at poisoned waters, he carefully recorded what he saw in a weather-beaten notebook. Water clarity, fish sightings, the condition of the barriers. His entries grew more optimistic with each passing week. Spotted 3 gray mullet near the second barrier today, he wrote one morning in early April. Water clear enough to see 1 meter down. The village itself was healing alongside its waters. Families who had left began to return, reopening shuttered houses and clearing away months of neglect. The school welcomed back students, though classes were often held outdoors as children participated in the ongoing restoration work. Mrs. Yoon's store shelves gradually refilled as she extended credit to returning fishermen who promised payment from future catches. Not everything went smoothly. A spring storm damaged several of the bamboo structures, requiring emergency repairs and adjustments to the design. Some villagers grew impatient with the slow pace of recovery, arguing for more aggressive interventions. Government officials periodically visited, alternating between taking credit for the improvement and expressing skepticism about the unscientific approach. Through it all, Ms. Bay's team remained, though in diminishing numbers as they gradually transferred leadership to the villagers themselves. Ms. Bay had been clear from the beginning. This wasn't a solution they were delivering, but rather a process they were teaching. You need to understand every aspect of the restoration, she told the group of villagers who had emerged as natural leaders during the project. Because the real work isn't fixing this crisis, it's preventing the next one. By midsummer, the Yathi difference was unmistakable. Satellite images confirmed what ground observations had reported. The invasive algae was in retreat across more than 60% of the bay. Areas that had been completely choked were now showing healthy water circulation and reviving plant life. The first commercial fishing expedition ventured out on a warm June morning. 5 boats, their engines freshly reinstalled or repaired, headed to waters that had been declared safe by both Ms. Bay's team and government scientists. Mr. Kim went along on his nephew's boat, not to fish, but to witness what felt like a historic moment. They returned with a modest catch. Nothing like the hauls of years past, but enough to sell at the local market and mark the official return of the village's traditional livelihood. The celebration that night spilled out of the community hall and onto the beach, where fires burned late into the evening as people shared food, stories, and cautious optimism about the future. We couldn't have done this 6 months ago, Mr. Du admitted, sitting beside Mr. Kim as they watched younger villagers dancing to music someone had rigged up through portable speakers. I didn't believe in this hippie bamboo nonsense. I was wrong. Mr. Kim smiled. We were all wrong in different ways. We thought someone would rescue us with big machines and miracle chemicals. Instead, we rescued ourselves with sticks and stubborn, hard work, Mrs. Yoon added, joining them with cups of barley tea. The next morning, government officials arrived for what had become a monthly assessment. This time, they brought a team from the National Environmental Agency and several journalists. The village, once forgotten except as an ecological disaster story, was now being held up as a model of community-led environmental restoration. Mr. Kim watched with mixed feelings as the officials posed for photos in front of the clearest sections of water, making statements about partnership and innovative approaches. None of them mentioned how they had initially dismissed Ms. Bay's methods or tried to block the project. But perhaps that didn't matter now. What mattered was that their village had a future again, and more importantly, they had knowledge they hadn't possessed before. Ms. Bay found Mr. Kim later that day, away from the cameras and official tours. She had announced earlier that she would be leaving at the end of the week, moving on to another community facing a different environmental challenge. Your village doesn't need me anymore, she said, joining him on his favorite spot overlooking the harbor. You've become the experts now. Mr. Kim nodded slowly. We've learned more than how to fight algae. We've learned how to work together again. It was true. The crisis had ultimately strengthened connections that had been weakening for years before. The algae appeared. Young people who had been drifting away from traditional knowledge now sought out elders for their understanding of tides and currents. Children who might have grown up glued to screens had instead developed intimate familiarity with their natural environment. The government wants to create a formal program based on what we did here, Ms. Bay told him. They're calling it the Human-Centered Environmental Restoration Initiative. Lots of fancy words for a simple idea. Which is? Mr. Kim asked. That sometimes the most powerful technology is human community with deep understanding of a place, she replied. The patience to observe, the wisdom to work with natural systems rather than against them, and the strength that comes from many hands working together. A week later, the village gathered to say goodbye to Ms. Bay and her remaining team members. The farewell ceremony was held on the beach at sunset, with tables of food prepared by every family and lanterns hanging from posts driven into the sand. As a gift, they presented her with a hand-drawn map of the village and its waters, marked, with all the barriers and restoration zones, signed by every resident from the oldest grandfather to the youngest schoolchild. On the reverse side, they had written the story of their crisis and recovery, not as a scientific case study but as a human narrative of despair and renewed hope. So others can learn not just what we did, but how it felt, explained the school teacher who had organized the project. As darkness fell and stars appeared over waters that now reflected their light clearly, Mr. Kim found himself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching young children chase each other across sand that no longer held dead fish. The harbor lights shone on boats ready for tomorrow's early departure. Life had returned, different in some ways, the same in others, but continuing. A small hand slipped into his and he looked down to find his grandson smiling up at him. "Grandpa," the boy said thoughtfully, "is the ocean still angry with us?" "Mr." Kim considered the question carefully. "I don't think it was ever angry," he finally replied. "I think it was trying to tell us something important, and we finally learned how to listen." Together they walked down to where gentle waves lapped, at the shore, clear enough now to see the darting shadows of small fish in the moonlight.